May 22, 1980, Long Island, New York. A woman sits alone in a station wagon outside a suburban shopping plaza. Engine running. Hands shaking on the wheel. She is waiting for a call that will decide whether her husband lives past sunset. Federal agents are already watching the house. Her children are asleep 2 miles away. Unaware their mother has spent the morning deciding who to betray, the men who raised her as family, or the man who fathered her kids. The Mafia does not forgive women who know too much. And Karen Hill knew everything. This is not a story about a gangster. This is the story of the woman standing next to him, the one history reduced to a Hollywood wife, when in truth, she made choices that could have gotten her killed twice over. Karen Friedman was not born into this world. That is the detail every account underplays. She grew up in a middle-class Jewish family on Long Island. Her father was a hard-working man with no tolerance for criminals, no patience for shortcuts, no respect for men who made money without earning it. Structure, discipline, rules, that was the house Karen came from. Then, in 1965, at a neighbor's party, she met Henry Hill. He was magnetic, confident in a way that felt dangerous and safe at the same time. He didn't explain what he did for work. He didn't need to. Cash appeared. Doors opened. Restaurants rearranged tables the moment he walked in. Karen would later admit what many spouses of organized crime figures admit only in private. She knew something was wrong, and she didn't ask questions, because not asking was its own kind of safety. Her father tried to warn her. He hired a private investigator to look into Henry's background. When the report came back describing a man tied to organized crime, her father forbade the relationship outright. Karen married him anyway. This decision is the hinge of her entire story, not the violence that came later, not the trial. This moment, a young woman choosing the version of security that came wrapped in danger over the version her family had built for her out of stability. Because that's what the Mafia offered people like Karen. Not romance, not rebellion. Belonging with a price tag attached, one she wouldn't see the full cost of for 15 years. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't muscle. She wasn't a made member of anything. She was an observer standing inside a war, mistaking the calm for peace. By the early 1970s, Karen Hill was no longer an outsider looking in. She was embedded. Henry worked under the Lucchese crime family, tied closely to Capo Paul Vario and to Jimmy Burke, a man whose name alone could empty a room. This was not glamorous crime. This was a structured, disciplined hierarchy, built on loyalty, fear, and silence. At the top, the boss, insulated, untouchable, rarely seen. Below him, capos, running crews, answering upward, protecting downward. Below them, soldiers and associates like Henry men, who made money for the family without ever being formally initiated into it. Because Henry wasn't fully Italian. He could earn for the Mafia. He could never belong to it. Karen learned this distinction early, and it explains everything that followed. Her husband would spend 2 decades enriching men who would never fully protect him, because the rules of the family did not extend to him the same way they extended to blood. Money moved constantly. Furs, jewelry, cash, stuffed envelopes. Karen adapted to a life where financial questions simply stopped being asked. She wore mink coats, bought with money that had no name attached to it. She raised her children in a house paid for by favors, not paychecks. And she began doing something more dangerous than spending the money. She began keeping it. When federal pressure increased and Henry needed a place to hide drug proceeds, guns, and hijacked goods, Karen let her home become the storage unit for evidence that could send her husband to prison for the rest of his life. This is the detail rarely emphasized. Karen Hill was not a passive bystander to organized crime. She was an active participant in concealment, aware of the stakes, calculating the risk each time she said nothing. The Mafia does not require women to pull triggers. It only requires silence. Karen gave them that, willingly, for years. But silence has an expiration date. And by the late 1970s, the walls funding this lifestyle were already beginning to buckle under debt, under drugs, under a federal investigation that was quietly building a case none of them saw coming. The turning point did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a slow collapse, one Karen watched happen inside her own home. By the mid-1970s, Henry Hill was no longer just a Mafia associate skimming profits off hijackings and loan sharking. He had become a cocaine trafficker, running product through connections in Pittsburgh, moving weight that generated more cash than any of his legitimate rackets ever had. This was the unwritten rule every crew member understood. Drugs were forbidden. Paul Vario had made that clear. The families had learned from Prohibition-era mistakes narcotics brought federal attention no bribe could neutralize. Henry ignored the rule. And Karen, once again, said nothing. She watched cash multiply. She watched Henry's paranoia multiply alongside it. Guns appeared in drawers that used to hold silverware. Phone calls got shorter, more clipped, more coded. The children were told to stay upstairs when certain men visited. Karen began living two lives inside one house, the mother making breakfast, and the woman who understood her husband was now breaking a rule that could get him killed by his own family, not just imprisoned by the government. Then came May 11th, 1980. Federal agents arrested Henry on narcotics trafficking charges. For the first time, this wasn't a hijacking case that could be smoothed over with a payoff. This was the kind of charge that came with mandatory decades behind bars, and worse. It was the kind of charge that made Henry a liability to men who solved liabilities permanently. Karen understood something in that moment that she had spent 15 years avoiding. The family that had provided everything, the money, the status, the illusion of protection, would not protect Henry now. If anything, his arrest made him more dangerous to them alive than dead. For the first time, Karen wasn't just hiding evidence. She was calculating survival. To understand why Henry's arrest was a death sentence waiting to happen, you have to understand what the federal government had already learned to do to organized crime by 1980, and where that knowledge came from. In 1963, a low-level Genovese soldier named Joseph Valachi did something no mobster had done publicly before. He testified in front of the U.S. Senate, describing the inner structure of La Cosa Nostra in detail, the chain of command, the induction rituals, the code of silence known as a MIRT. Valachi didn't bring down an empire, but he handed the government a map. For the next decade, federal prosecutors used that map to build something the Mafia had never faced before. RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, allowed prosecutors to charge entire criminal enterprises as a single conspiracy, not just individual crimes, but the structure itself. By the time Henry Hill was arrested in 1980, the FBI had spent nearly 2 decades refining exactly the kind of pressure that could break men like him. They understood the psychology of organized crime better than most captains inside it. They knew associates like Henry men, who earned for the family, but were never fully protected by it, were the weakest structural point. Non-made men had the most to lose and the least institutional loyalty holding them in place. This was the political machinery closing in around the Hill family, invisible to Karen until it wasn't. The government wasn't just prosecuting a drug case. It was executing a strategy, refined since Valachi, designed specifically to turn men like Henry into witnesses. And to do that, prosecutors needed leverage. They found it in the one thing Henry could not risk losing: his family. Federal agents did not go to Henry first. They went to Karen. This was deliberate. Prosecutors understood something about organized crime, that the families themselves often underestimated the wives, were rarely just spectators. They were witnesses to decades of financial crimes, hidden weapons, and conversations never meant to leave the house. Karen was brought in and shown the weight of what the government already had: wiretaps, financial records, evidence tying the home itself to hidden narcotics money. She was told plainly that she could be charged alongside her husband, that ignorance was not a defense for a decade of concealment. At the same time, a separate, more immediate danger was closing in. Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke had learned of Henry's arrest. In their world, an arrested associate wasn't just an inconvenience, he was an open channel to the government. Jimmy Burke, in particular, had grown suspicious that Henry might talk, and men suspected of talking rarely got the chance to prove otherwise. Karen would later describe the moment the danger became personal rather than legal. Jimmy Burke asked to meet with her alone. The invitation itself was a threat disguised as courtesy. In a world built on outward friendliness masking calculated violence, a private one-on-one meeting from a man like Burke was not a social visit. She avoided the meeting. That decision may have saved her life. Here was Karen's true position, stripped of any illusion. The federal government was threatening her with prison. The family that had protected her for 15 years was now a potential threat to her safety. And her husband, facing decades behind bars, could offer her no protection at all. She was, for the first time since 1965, completely alone. The Mafia's power had always depended on isolating its threats before they could organize against it. Now Karen understood she wasn't just adjacent to that machinery. She was inside it. There was no gunshot, no trigger pulled. The execution in this story was not of a body, it was of an entire way of life, carried out by Karen and Henry together, in a decision made under unbearable pressure. Henry, facing life in prison and increasingly convinced Jimmy Burke intended to have him killed before he could testify, made contact with federal prosecutors. He offered cooperation, full testimony on the inner workings of the Lucchese crew, the hijackings, the murders he had knowledge of, the entire architecture of the operation he had spent 15 years inside. But Henry's cooperation meant nothing without Karen's. The witness protection program did not exist to save one man. It existed to erase an entire family's identity, which meant Karen had to make the same decision Henry made, except she was making it for her children as much as herself. She had to decide, in the span of days, whether to walk away from everything that had defined her adult life, the name Hill, the city she grew up in, the extended network of relationships built over a decade and a half, all of it, gone, in exchange for safety with no guarantee attached. Federal marshals arrived to relocate the family under emergency protocol. There was no dramatic showdown, no cinematic gun battle. The true tension was quieter and more devastating: a woman packing her children's belongings into unmarked boxes, aware that Jimmy Burke and men loyal to him were still out there, and that leaving too slowly could be fatal. Karen's own words, given years later, captured the moment better than any dramatization could. She said she felt like she was disappearing before she had even left. This was the execution. Not a killing, but an erasure: identity, history, family name, all sacrificed on the same day, in exchange for a future that came with no certainty of forgiveness, only the temporary certainty of survival. She chose her children in the only way still available to her. She chose to disappear with them, rather than risk staying as the woman the Mafia once considered family. Henry Hill's testimony helped convict Paul Vario and contributed to cases against numerous associates connected to the Lucchese crime family. The information he provided on the 1978 Lufthansa heist and related crimes became part of one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions of the era. For Karen, the aftermath offered no clean resolution. Witness protection did not deliver peace, it delivered a different kind of confinement. New names, new cities, constant relocation, whenever Henry's behavior, drug use, or carelessness threatened to expose their location. The marshals themselves would later describe Henry as one of the most difficult witnesses they had ever protected, incapable of staying invisible even when invisibility was the only thing keeping his family alive. Karen and Henry eventually separated, then divorced, decades after the choice that bound them together in protection. She remained largely out of public narrative for years, her story absorbed into the mythology built around her husband most visibly through Hollywood's dramatization of these events, which centered Henry as the protagonist and reduced Karen to a supporting figure in someone else's story. But the historical record tells a different version of events. Karen was not merely present for the crimes that defined this case. She stored evidence. She raised children inside an operation built on federal crimes. She made an independent, high-stakes decision to enter protection, fully aware it meant surrendering her identity and severing ties with everyone she had known as family, chosen, and biological alike. The Mafia does not measure loyalty by proximity. It measures it by silence, and by what a person is willing to sacrifice to protect the organization's secrets. Karen Hill broke that measure the moment survival outweighed loyalty. Return to that station wagon. May 22, 1980, engine running. A woman deciding whether her family survives the next 24 hours. That moment was never really about Henry. It was about the myth every organized crime family sells its members and their spouses alike, the myth that loyalty is protection, that silence is safety, that belonging to something powerful means you will never stand alone. Karen Hill believed that myth for 15 years, and when it finally collapsed, it collapsed completely, revealing what had always been true underneath it: the family does not save you. It only delays the moment you must save yourself. This is the story organized crime rarely tells about itself. Not the violence history is full of that, but the quieter, more permanent cost paid by the people standing beside the men who carry the guns. The wives who launder more than money, the children who inherit fear before they inherit understanding. The identities erased not by a bullet, but by the simple act of choosing to keep breathing. Karen Hill did not choose the Mafia over her children. She chose disappearance, so her children could have a version of a future the Mafia was never going to allow them to keep. The station wagon's engine is still running, somewhere in memory. She is still deciding. She will always be deciding.